Okay, this one should be a bit of fun. The premise is pretty simple. I'll be taking each GOAT candidate at their prime level and pitting them in an imaginary matchup against the current champion of their division in their modern form. I'll be giving a solid prediction at the end of each section, while inviting you guys to do the same in the comments below. And I will point out, given the progression of the sport in recent years, the quality of athlete and the overall evolution of the game from a foundational level, just because in some cases I would pick the modern fighter to win, it of course doesn't necessarily mean that I think that they're a greater competitor or champion. Like the great Michael Jordan once remarked, comparing one era to another era is not a realistic way to try and make an argument about greatness. But with that out of the way, let's just get into it. Strawweight, Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jedrzejczyk. Okay, to kick things off, we have one of the few matchups here that we have already seen before. The former champion Weili Zhang just managed to beat Carla Esparza definitively at UFC 281 to re-establish herself as the number one 115-pound fighter on the planet. Now indeed, we have seen Zhang go toe-to-toe with the divisional GOAT Joanna Jedrzejczyk on two different occasions, the second of which was nowhere near as competitive as the first. But I would argue that even that first bout did not showcase Joanna in her total prime. It wasn't far off, but even still. Weili took home a close decision in an all-time great battle that some people actually did score for the challenger. But here's the thing, this prime Joanna Jedrzejczyk may have a level or two extra to her game that she would benefit from if she took on Zhang under these circumstances. But I would argue that the modern-day Weili has improved significantly with each passing appearance, rounding out her game to better utilize her natural physicality no matter where the fight takes place. This would certainly be a competitive one, there's little doubt about it, but I do think that Weili would win, moving past a very game Jedrzejczyk for a unanimous decision win over 5 rounds. I think she would hurt Joanna, but the Polish former champion's toughness would keep her in the fight, given that she had not yet taken on the boatload of damage that came from their actual first fight, as well as her pair of battles with Rose Namajunas.
Flyweight. We just saw this fight, so with that in mind, we should be able to confidently say that Alexa Grasso is capable of beating and stopping Valentina Shevchenko once again. And to be honest, that's perfectly true. But I suppose my questions over Shevchenko last time around would be based on where she is right now in relation to her prime, how motivated she remains, and how she may have overlooked or underplanned in relation to Alexa Grasso's strengths. So I'm not quite being asked to predict a rematch here, because in this current champ versus GOAT situation, I don't want to overcomplicate things too much by bringing up multiple realities and whatnot. Like, does Valentina have an awareness of what she knows now about Grasso in her GOAT form? But I am going to say that Shevchenko wins by unanimous decision, simply because I feel like if these two fought 10 times, I have faith in the former champion's ability to win this pairing more than half the time. Bantamweight and featherweight. Okay, so obviously Amanda Nunes is the divisional GOAT at both bantamweight and featherweight, and given that she can't fight herself, we're just going to move on. Flyweight. Brandon Moreno versus Demetrius Johnson. Across 4 shockingly good flyweight title fights, Brandon Moreno has truly proven himself to be one of the best fighters in the lower weight classes, to navigate the dangerous power that Davison Figueiredo brings to the table and come out with as many knockdowns on him as Moreno did. Yeah, that says a lot. But how does Brandon fare in there with the GOAT, the great Demetrius Johnson? Well, it's hard to know. Johnson was and potentially still is the most technically advanced and well-rounded fighter we've ever seen. Moreno does have him for size though and for power, and his cardio and toughness, and to his credit the well-roundedness he brings, should make him an incredibly tough night at the office for Mighty Mouse. But I just can't pick against a prime DJ though. The man is just too talented, too intelligent, and with 25 minutes to work, I think he figures out his best path to victory and acts on it. I got Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson by a hard-fought decision. Bantamweight. Aljamain Sterling versus Dominic Cruz. This next one is a very tough pick. On one hand, you have the GOAT in Dominic Cruz, whose speed and footwork in his prime made him one of the most electric defensive strikers the sport has ever known. And I'm aware that the words electric and defensive are not usually placed together, but that's exactly how it was. He also had fantastic wrestling and fight IQ. You could place his exact prime as anywhere during the end of his WEC run and the start of his time in the UFC. Hell, if you do believe that experience trumps minor degradations in physical ability, I'd even put in a vote for the Dominic Cruz who beat TJ Dillashaw to be considered as close enough to his prime.
injuries and all. On the other side of the cage, you'd have Aljamain Sterling, an underrated champion who just can't catch a break. The Funkmaster has some very credible routes to victory against a fighter like Cruz, and I would back the current champion to be able to control any fighter at 135 pounds if he gets a hold of their back. I actually don't know, to be honest. This fight may spring up a lot of problems for both guys. Cruz has shown himself to be susceptible to a certain type of offense, especially in this modern game, and fighters who have the intelligence of a Henry Cejudo or Marlon Vera have been able to time him and get him out of there. But let's not forget that Cruz at that point in time was a lot older, a lot more shop-worn. Will him being at his quickest and most mentally sharp make a difference against a modern fighter like Aldo? I'm not totally certain, but I'm going to pick Sterling by decision and back the more modern, updated, multifaceted fighter. But it is probably just about as unsure a pick as I'll make today. Featherweight. Alexander Volkanovski versus Jose Aldo. Indeed, we have seen this one before, but again, I would argue that neither man was quite in his prime. The actual fight between the current pound-for-pound #1 Alexander Volkanovski and the former pound-for-pound #1 Jose Aldo played out in a way that was unexpected to me at the time. It seemed as though Volk just totally nullified Jose with his feints and movement, outthinking him as much as he outstruck him. And though Aldo would go on to have great success in the bantamweight division, he wasn't exactly in his prime per se. But even still, you take the best version of Jose Aldo and put him in there with today's Alexander Volkanovski, and I would be willing to bet that Volk, after a competitive opening round or so, begins to take over this fight with confidence. Aldo is of course one of my all-time favorites, and a true top 10 fighter of all time, but skill for skill, technique for technique. I think we're slowly learning that Alexander Volkanovski is not only the best fighter in the world today, but he also stands as one of the most technically advanced fighters to ever do it. I'm going to take Volk by a 5th round TKO, although a 49-46 decision after a strong opening round for Jose is equally likely. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all of our weekly uploads. Lightweight. Islam Makhachev versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Out of all of the fights that we could ever feature here, none of them would be as unlikely to happen as this one. It would be like forcing Nick Diaz to take on Nate. But seeing as you've already clicked on the video and you're expecting me to break this down, let's get into it. Obviously, the prime version of Khabib could be taken from any point during his title reign, but I do believe that his win over Justin Gaethje showed all of the best parts of his game, especially when he got a hold of him. Now, Islam Makhachev is of course a protege of Nurmagomedov, and given how well they know each other, who knows which one of the two could use that knowledge to their advantage more. But if we're taking this as a straight fight, contracts are signed, camps begin, ignore all of the rest, I do think that Khabib is the better fighter. Now with that being said, we just don't know how good Islam is either, because he appears to raise his ceiling every time he makes the walk. But as much as Makhachev is the guy right now, I think the safe money is on Khabib being the better fighter of the two. That may be proven false in time, and again, it's almost impossible to imagine how a fight between these two masters of that Dagestani style would go down. But if I have to get specific, maybe we'd get something like what we saw from Mateusz Gamrot and Arman Tsarukyan, two excellent high-level wrestlers who nearly cancel each other out but not quite. Islam may in fact have the striking advantage, which is an interesting point, because if Nurmagomedov can't get him down, like a Gleison Tibau for example, and Islam can't do the same for him, might Makhachev have the advantage? I don't know. I just see the Eagle as such a fantastic competitor that I'd back him to win this fight in whatever realm it had to take place in. So yeah, I'll take Nurmagomedov in a competitive decision victory. But whatever about the pick, this is the hardest one to conceptualize. Welterweight. Leon Edwards versus Georges St. Pierre. The welterweights come in next as their champion Leon Edwards faces off against a guy in Georges St. Pierre who, out of his contemporaries in the overall GOAT conversation, is seen by most fighters and analysts as the most likely great fighter to see their skill set and attributes translate perfectly to the modern game. GSP was methodical, technical, athletic as hell, and just a fantastic fight manager. And though it's obvious that Leon Edwards is the more modern MMA product, I think St. Pierre would be a fitting challenge who wouldn't look out of place whatsoever in today's 170-pound landscape, despite being nearly 10 years away from the division. In fact, I would actually narrowly favour him to win this fight. Of course, Edwards is very crafty in every facet of the game, and like Usman, GSP would need to be wary of his striking. But as much as I think this would be more competitive than most might expect, I still think that St. Pierre would find his way to a decision victory in a relatively comfortable but not untroubled fashion. Middleweight. Alex Pereira versus Anderson Silva. I've gone back and forth on this one. We all know that the newly crowned 185-pound champion Alex Pereira has some very real holes in his game, and like Israel Adesanya, a prime Anderson Silva would be an opponent who would offer up some very real routes to victory. Silva is not just a striker, even less so than Israel Adesanya, and while I do think that there's a chance that Pereira's physicality could negate any real wrestling threat that the Spider could spring up, but if Izzy was able to carve out some time on the mat, I do think that Silva could also find his way there. A part of me thinks that Silva's natural style of fighting, the head movement, the odd parries that he does, these things could actually make Alex Pereira a nightmare matchup for him in some ways. Again, I don't want to lean on recency bias or take away anything from Silva's incredible MMA run, but styles do make fights, and Pereira shouldn't have beaten a UFC champion in his 4th promotional outing, but the stylistic matchup made it very possible. And though I'm going to pick Silva by 3rd round submission because he's Anderson Silva, it's not a pick I'm making with great confidence. I'd be interested to hear exactly what you guys think about this fight in the comment section below, because for me, it's definitely the one that I went back and forth on the most.
Light heavyweight, Jamal Hill versus Jon Jones. Jamal Hill put on a real showcase as he thoroughly beat down Glover Teixeira to earn his UFC light heavyweight title. But the general feeling that came from that fight, despite the stellar performance he turned in against the aging former divisional king, was that Hill, though impressive, might not even be in the top 3 best 205 pounders in the world. Now that to me is harsh in some ways, but I do need to see more. In my view, the likes of Magomed Ankalaev, Jan Blachowicz, and the former champion who never lost his belt, Yuri Prochazka, should all be favoured in fights against the reigning champion, but we're not here to talk about them. No, we're here to look at Jamal Hill and how he fares against a prime Jon Jones. And yeah, I don't think this would be a close fight. Perhaps the length and power of Hill when coupled with his takedown defense might give Jones some trouble at first, but I just see 2 very different calibers of champion, and I think Jon scores a late submission to get this current belt holder out of there. Heavyweight. Speaking of Jon Jones, his heavyweight debut gave us quite a few answers as to how this guy was going to look after all that time off, in a new division, sporting a newly thickened frame, but it also didn't really show us much of his game, his cardio, and his ability to contend for long stretches with a dangerous heavyweight in front of him. That's no knock on Jon, of course, but I don't believe that we're necessarily that much closer to an answer on Jones versus Stipe Miocic than we would have been a month or 2 ago. But hey, it doesn't really matter, because even with all of these unknowns, I think Jon would beat a prime pre-Cormier trilogy Stipe in a very impressive effort. I don't think he'd have it all his own way on the feet, and Miocic's own wrestling game may prove to be a counter to Jones's, but I just think that Jon is too smart, too diverse, and way too reliable over 25 minutes to lose here. So I'm going to go with a late submission maybe, or more likely, a comfortable unanimous decision victory.
And that will just about do it for this video. But how did you think we did with our takes on the matchups? And how would each current champion fare in your eyes? If you want to help in supporting the channel, liking the video and subscribing would do wonders. As always, thank you for watching.